You've been told that Roman triumphs were celebrations of military glory, spectacular parades, where victorious generals rode through Rome in golden chariots, while crowds cheered and captives walked in chains. But what the histories don't emphasize is what happened after the parade ended, in the darkness beneath the Capitoline Hill, where the Tullianum prison waited, and where the enemy commander who had walked the entire triumph route in humiliation was strangled to death while the victory banquet was still underway above. Right now, in the archaeological remains beneath Rome's churches and monuments, you can still find the stone chamber where this happened dozens of times. A ritual killing so embedded in triumph protocol that it appears in military manuals as standard procedure. Yet modern retellings of Roman glory consistently erase this final act from the narrative, presenting triumph as spectacle and celebration, while ignoring the systematic execution that gave the entire ceremony its meaning. Let me show you why every triumph, not some, not most, but every traditional triumph, ended in a killing that was simultaneously public knowledge and deliberately obscured, and what this reveals about how Rome understood victory, humiliation, and the political necessity of turning human beings into sacrificial objects. Here's what we know for certain. The triumph was Rome's highest military honor, granted by senatorial decree to generals who had achieved extraordinary victories. The requirements were specific. You needed to kill at least 5,000 enemy combatants in a single campaign, extend Roman territory, defeat a foreign enemy rather than Roman citizens, and return with sufficient plunder to finance the celebration itself. When granted, the triumph followed a precise ritual sequence that hadn't changed significantly in over 500 years. The general, dressed as Jupiter, his face painted red with minium, rode in a four-horse chariot through predetermined streets while a slave stood behind him whispering memento mori, remember you are mortal. His soldiers followed, singing obscene songs mocking their commander. Captives walked in chains. Wagons displayed plunder. And at the end, when the procession reached the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, the captive enemy commander was separated from the parade and taken down the slope to the Tullianum. Listen carefully to what the sources actually say. Livy describes the triumph of Aemilius Paulus in 167 BCE. Perseus, the king of Macedon, walked before the chariot with his children, and when the procession reached the capital, Perseus was not led up to the temple but conducted to the prison, where the customary end of triumph was performed. The customary end. Plutarch, writing about the triumph of Marius in 104 BCE, is more explicit. Jugurtha was stripped of his royal robes and gold earrings were torn from his ears with such violence that the lobes were ripped. Then he was thrust into the dungeon, where after 6 days of starvation he was strangled. Suetonius, describing Caesar's quadruple triumph in 46 BCE, notes almost casually, Vercingetorix was executed following the parade as was proper. As was proper, read that phrase again, the execution wasn't an aberration, it wasn't revenge, it was protocol. The Tullianum itself still exists, buried beneath the church of San Giuseppe dei Felgnami. Modern visitors see a small chapel. Beneath it is a chamber that was ancient when the Republic fell, a round stone room approximately 20 feet across, accessed only through a hole in the ceiling. No windows, no door. Once you were lowered through that hole, the only way out was death. The chamber is spring-fed, so the floor is perpetually wet, and Roman historians record that prisoners waited there in complete darkness, sometimes for days, until the executioner came. The method was strangulation, performed by public executioners called carnifices who worked for the state. It wasn't quick. It wasn't clean. And it happened within hours of the triumph's conclusion, while the general was still receiving congratulations at the victory feast. Now understand what this means for how we interpret Roman triumph. This wasn't incidental violence. This was the ceremony's climax, its theological and political completion. The entire triumph was a ritual journey that transformed the enemy commander from a military threat into a sacred object whose death sanctified Roman victory. Every step was choreographed toward that ending. The humiliation of walking in chains through hostile crowds, the stripping of royal regalia, the descent into the earth, this was liturgy. The execution wasn't separate from the celebration. It was the moment when celebration became complete. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Roman sources describe this execution as necessary, inevitable, divinely sanctioned, and then immediately move on. Livy devotes hundreds of words to describing chariot decorations and crowd reactions, then dispenses with the actual killing in a single subordinate clause. Plutarch provides gruesome detail about Jugurtha's torture, then transitions seamlessly to describing the banquet menu. The structural message is clear. The execution matters enough to mention, but not enough to dwell on. It's simultaneously essential and invisible public knowledge that must not be examined too closely. Why? Because acknowledging what triumph actually entailed would force uncomfortable questions about what Romans were celebrating. Victory. No, triumphs could be granted for campaigns that weren't strategically significant. Pliny records triumphs celebrated for victories over poorly armed tribes that posed no genuine threat to Rome. Military skill? Also no. Triumphs could be purchased through political connections or awarded for inheriting someone else's campaign. What triumph actually celebrated was the transformation of foreign sovereignty into Roman dominance, performed through ritualized humiliation and killing. The enemy commander had to die because his continued existence represented the possibility that his people might remain ungoverned by Rome. His death didn't just end a military campaign, it symbolically ended his nation's independent political existence. The evidence becomes even more disturbing when you examine who was actually executed. Roman triumph protocol required a legitimate enemy commander of royal or equivalent status. If such a person wasn't captured, the triumph couldn't be properly completed. This created a perverse incentive. Generals campaigning for triumph needed to ensure they captured the right kind of prisoner. We have documented cases where Roman commanders deliberately prolonged sieges to capture fleeing kings, passed over militarily advantageous truces to prevent enemy leaders from escaping, and even fabricated claims about prisoners' status to satisfy triumph requirements. Vercingetorix, the Gallic commander executed after Caesar's triumph, had actually surrendered himself to prevent further Roman atrocities against his people. Caesar kept him imprisoned for 6 years, waiting for the politically opportune moment to celebrate a triumph and complete the required execution. That's not military necessity. That's keeping a human being alive specifically to kill him in a particular ceremonial context. This is the part historians rarely mention. We have the names of at least 47 individuals executed following triumphs during the Republic and early Empire. 47 documented cases where a human being walked the triumph route knowing with absolute certainty that they would be strangled in the Tullianum within hours. And that's just the executions prominent enough to be recorded. Triumphs celebrating victories over multiple enemies sometimes included multiple executions. Pompey's triumph over Mithridates included the killing of 5 captured generals. When you account for lesser-known triumphs, provincial celebrations, and ovations that may have included similar practices, you're looking at hundreds of ritual executions performed over 5 centuries of Roman expansion. And the children understand this. When enemy commanders were captured with their families, Roman protocol required that children above a certain age also participate in the triumph procession. They weren't automatically spared. Livy records that Perseus of Macedon's children walked in his triumph, but sources are deliberately vague about what happened to them afterward. We know that very young children were sometimes adopted by Roman families, a form of cultural erasure that served imperial purposes. But adolescent sons of defeated kings represented future threats, potential rallying points for resistance. The historical record contains suspicious gaps around their fates. Tacitus mentions almost in passing that after Germanicus's triumph in 17 CE, the children of Arminius who had marched in the parade disappeared into servitude, a phrase that probably conceals execution or abandonment. Now trace the silences. Roman historians who describe triumphs in detail, Livy, Plutarch, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, all follow the same narrative pattern. Elaborate description of the parade, brief mention of execution, immediate transition to celebration or political aftermath. The killing is acknowledged but never analyzed, described but never questioned. This isn't because Romans were squeamish about violence. Their literature is full of graphic battle descriptions and gladiatorial details. The silence around triumph executions is different. It's the silence that surrounds acts that are simultaneously necessary to mention and dangerous to examine. Why dangerous? Because triumph was the ceremony that most perfectly embodied Roman imperial ideology. It demonstrated that Rome's enemies could be captured, humiliated, and eliminated. It proved that foreign sovereignty was conditional, that resistance ended in death, that Roman power was both absolute and divinely sanctioned. To question the execution was to question the entire symbolic apparatus that justified expansion. So the execution had to happen, had to be public knowledge, but couldn't be examined as a moral act. It had to exist in a strange liminal space, visible but not seen, known but not discussed, essential but not acknowledged as problematic. The machinery of this silence was sophisticated. Triumph narratives consistently focus on spectacle: the golden chariot, the red face paint, the laurel crown, the white bulls for sacrifice. These details overwhelm the narrative space so that by the time you reach the execution it feels like an afterthought. But sequence matters. The triumph route was carefully designed. It began at the Campus Martius, outside the sacred boundary of the city, then entered through the Porta Triumphalis, proceeded through the Forum Boarium, around the Palatine, through the Forum Romanum and up to the Capitoline. The entire route spiraled upward toward the temple of Jupiter, except the Tullianum was downward beneath the Capitoline. The execution required a physical reversal, a descent, literally taking the prisoner down into the earth. That spatial symbolism wasn't accidental. It marked the execution as separate from the celebration, happening in a different moral and physical space even though it was temporally and ritually continuous. Here's the evidence that makes this undeniable. We have the architectural remains, we have the literary descriptions, we have inscriptions celebrating triumphs that list the names of executed prisoners. But what we don't have, and this absence is revealing, is any Roman philosophical or legal text that analyzes triumph execution as an ethical question. Roman intellectuals wrote extensively about just war theory, about the proper treatment of prisoners, about the virtues of clemency. Cicero, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius all engaged deeply with questions of power and mercy, but none of them addressed triumph execution directly. The closest we get is Cicero defending clemency toward defeated enemies in general terms while simultaneously celebrating specific triumphs that included executions. The contradiction isn't resolved. It's not even acknowledged. This changes everything we think we know about Roman triumph. The standard narrative presents it as a celebration of military achievement, a reward for generals who expanded Roman power. But when you center the execution, when you recognize it as the ceremony's purpose rather than its epilogue, what you see is something much darker. A ritual technology for transforming foreign sovereignty into Roman dominance through the systematic humiliation and killing of captured leaders. The parade wasn't the point. The killing was the point. Everything else, the chariot, the plunder, the captives in chains, was theater designed to give that killing cosmic significance. And it worked. For over 500 years, triumph remained Rome's highest honor. Generals competed for it, politicians celebrated it, artists depicted it, historians recorded it. The execution that concluded each triumph was public knowledge, legally required, religiously sanctioned, and almost completely absent from cultural memory. When modern people imagine Roman triumph, they picture the parade. They don't picture the strangling. That selective memory isn't accidental. It's the final victory of Roman propaganda. Even in defeat, even after the empire's collapse, the narrative structures that obscured triumph's violence continue to shape how we remember Roman power. The definitive truth is this: Roman triumph always ended in execution because the execution was the ritual's purpose. The celebration, the parade, the religious offering, these were the frame. The killing was the picture. And the silence that surrounded that killing, the narrative structures that acknowledged it while refusing to examine it, reveal something crucial about how imperial power sustains itself. Through violence that is simultaneously visible and invisible, public and private, celebrated and erased. If you've learned anything about how ancient societies constructed elaborate rituals around state violence, while simultaneously developing narrative strategies to make that violence seem natural and necessary, hit that subscribe button on Mythbusting. We're going to keep uncovering the mechanisms of power that traditional history prefers to celebrate rather than examine. The uncomfortable truth is that triumph wasn't an aberration of Roman culture. It was its purest expression, combining religious theater, political power, and ritual killing into a ceremony that trained both Romans and their subjects to see imperial violence as divinely sanctioned spectacle. So what other glorious, historical traditions should we examine for the violence they've carefully edited out of popular memory? Drop your suggestions in the comments below.